Good morning, good morning, good morning. I'm Jonathan, and we are NycosRPG, and today on Game Master Soapbox, we are going to be talking about the evolution of game stores. Now, people may not be aware of the pathway that brought us to where we are currently, but the game store, as you think of it, the localized, full-service, games based on the side kind of location, simply didn't exist at all. There was no equivalency to it when games as a hobby first started. Now that doesn't mean there weren't those odd places once in a while where a person is a games fancier who happens to own a retail store. I'm not necessarily I'm not trying to say that there were none, but the concept of the look them up on your phone and find them in your local area game stores simply were non-existent in the past. Hey, if you haven't been with us before, this is NycosRPG, and we highly recommend that you check out the program that we have developing on patreon.com. We are establishing and preparing for a Kickstarter on in the near future for our role-playing system called NycosRPG. But we are not focusing on the day, but we do want you to check out patreon.com/Nykos for more information. NYCOS, like the logo says. Ooh, I always get the messed up with what the logo says. All right. So we're going to talk about the evolution of game stores in general, and to give framework, the games industry had it had actually launched fairly effectively worldwide, really, in the 1930s, 1940s. There were, back in those ancient days, and this is even cloudy history for me because it's farther back than I actually go, but in the 40s and 30s, 40s, 50s, there were the occasional card parlor, and this wasn't, surprisingly, for gambling games per se. It was actually set up for games like bridge or pinochle. Depending on where you were in the country, there were different groups that would get together to play those, shall we say, more sophisticated card games. There were also chess clubs, and these were physical locations that had chess boards. Chess was, it wasn't that it was a non-existent game, but it was far from commonality. And so people that played at a competitive level preferred to play in the place where people actually took the game seriously. Not unlike, I suppose, our card game stores today, because the need to have people that are playing at a more competitive level means you need to be able to seek out opponents that are at or better than your current play level to hone your skills. This idea, therefore, of the game stores evolving comes from a place where there were virtually none. The few stores that would carry product that was sophisticated game mechanics alone didn't exist. The initial game stores, therefore, were being drawn from a slightly different crowd. And once I figure out where I put my buttons, I will put this up here. And the first of these are the specialty game stores. I'm sorry, see, I even did it right there. Specialty game stores. No, specialty hobby stores. One thing that was very diverse in that period of time were scale modelers, those people who built model aircraft or model automobiles, and these were at varying scales between what's called the classic HO scale, which I believe it's approximates 1/72nd scale. There were other models, of course, of larger vehicles, like larger vessels and aircraft like the Hindenburg and stuff, that had model model sets that you could buy that would be at a variety of different scales. For example, the train scale that was very prevalent at the time was considered N scale. It was an AC electrical system with a box transformer that turned the DC current from the wall back into AC current for the train to be pushed along, and it had 3 tracks instead of 2. It was a little off-putting because it was not visually trains. It was a method to emulate the motion of the train around the track, but the third rail was not, of course, what was required for the majority of real-time trains. There were, I suppose, if you counted like trolleys and such like that, places in the world where there would be multiple pickups on a roadway, but for the most part, the N scale was more utilitarian. It provided the purpose of putting your trains around the track, but it wasn't visually as compelling, let's say, as the later HO scales and such that used only 2 tracks and had the converter, if you will, in the engine itself. But the idea of the vehicles moving around tracks was highly popular. There were a lot of companies that would do pieces like mountains or bridges and such that you could build in scale to your railroad setups. And so people would have these monstrous dioramas, 8 by 12 sheets of plywood with their mountains and valleys and rivers and communities, and then they would snake their railway track through that area to create the visual of the miniaturization. And that was highly prized at the time. And so a lot of stores would carry the wide array of miniatures materials for that purpose. And, as a happenstance would be, a happy circumstance is they would also carry military units. The concept of miniatures warfare, because this was not something that was done by everybody on every corner, they would work in the most inexpensive metal possible, something that could be worked at a relatively low temperature and could be done pretty much in your own home if you were sophisticated enough. And so there were lead miniatures. They were heavy. They were, in most cases, virtually formless, but they were nonetheless meticulously painted in the colors of the units that they were involved with, and were made so that the unit could be faced in a specific direction, so you would know which was the front of the unit in terms of like line versus column, and therefore you could choose the direction that your unit was moving, and it was therefore represented on the tabletop. So again, that was a very small segment of the population, but these specialty stores would carry those units. They might carry, as I said, railroad units, perhaps balsa wood for whittling or for forming. There were also the concept of pine box derby, where you would build a car of a certain weight, and then it was put on ball bearing wheels, and you would put it onto races, wooden races, that is, and then the wooden race would act as a track, and you could do comparative speed competitions, basically sprints or drag races on a pine box slide. Or even at the more sophisticated, you'd have a slaloming pathway that was built with a gradual decline of it, so you could put your cars on it and have them race down these courses. All of these different hobbies were very prized by people, but they were not necessarily highly or widely known. And so these specialty stores would carry all of these little bits and orts and tools and such for all of these hobbies. So therefore they would have enough to be a thriving business. So a specialty hobby store would carry a selection of balsa wood, wooden rods, ball bearings, gear packs, all these different mechanisms for the different specialty hobbies to be supported. And you had to be pretty wide in terms of the things that you carried because you wanted to maintain fluidity in any economy. So as things became more tight, you would carry more practical things like the actual woodworking tools and such. Or back then, a really popular style was using an AC converter to actually do woodworking and wood burnishing. And this element of etching and wood burning was a hand hobby. Of course, nowadays we have laser printers and such that fill a similar or equivalent niche in our society. But the idea is that the specialty hobby stores were the only ones that would carry supplies that would be akin to what a games group might want to be looking for in today's modern marketplace. These specialties hobbies, when the very first of the role-playing products, Dungeons and Dragons, came out, the stores were so few and far between that most players were forced to either drive dozens of miles to get to a store that could support them, or there was a fairly thriving mail order business as well, where individuals would actually find out from a game store who their distributor was, where the product came from, and then the consumer would buy them directly through the mail. So ironically, the nowadays electronic marketplace where people purchase online and have things drop shipped to them is just an outgrowth, really, of that original process of purchase. Also, there were so few game masters, so to speak, that quite a few companies developed play-by-mail mechanisms where you would actually pay so much money per turn, send your turn in, and the game master would adjudicate what happened with your unit, provide you with an output that would tell you where you were, which way you were facing, how many units you had left, etc. And then you would go back and forth playing through the turns of a game in that fashion. And when we think of today and how rapid response we are, that we want instantaneous gratification for virtually anything we get involved with, it's kind of odd to think about the idea of a play-by-mail game, which might take anywhere between a week and 2 weeks per turn for the game to be affected. Nonetheless, the environment of those stores meant that the product didn't necessarily hold any particular value to the retailer other than what they paid. And so generally this is where the modern concept of keystone comes in, and that is that they would buy the product at a price and then literally just double it for their retail price, so they made back or recouped their losses on product that they brought in. And ostensibly, when a product did well, they'd buy 2 of them instead of buy 1, and so therefore now they've got twice as much inventory and therefore twice as much potential sale. And eventually, there was a considerable turnover. Now, distribution hadn't caught up yet. The manufacturers of games actually hired employees in different areas to be their representatives. So an individual might actually work for a particular brand, or in the case of their smaller distributors, the panoply of product they would carry. And so therefore they would actually have sales reps go into these specialties stores and say, hey, I noticed that you carry model paint. Perhaps you want to carry some of these newer acrylic paints, because there are people that are painting models that you have not tapped yet, or these are perhaps some colors you don't currently have, or I noticed that you're running a little low on coal black, and so I've got an offering by a manufacturer to carry coal black into your store, so you should buy a sleeve of black paints or whatever. And these salesmen were very up to speed on what they carried, but generally were less so than they perhaps could have been, simply because they were carrying also fairly wide lines. So a distributor that might carry a dice collection for you would more than likely also carry the wooden rods used for bridge building, or the balsa wood used for making ship models or whatever, or the full-out model kits. And so these distributors would have names that associated with the product lines that they carried. So, for example, in the case of ChessX, well, obviously they must be carrying chessboards, but that was only a singular line among all the products that ChessX would eventually carry. And of course, ChessX would start back east, and then they would build a place and call it ChessX West. And these were centralized distribution hubs that would then send these salespersons out as their representatives into the marketplaces. Well, then we come to what I call the second stage retailers. And when I speak of this, there is no official terminology for this. This is just my way of describing it to you to make it make sense. The idea here is that they saw the value of board games. They saw the shelf life and the evergreen nature of many of the games that were coming out, especially those that were being imported from Europe. And the Asian market in board games wasn't nearly as sophisticated yet. That was coming, but the second stage here would be a store that carried several Euro games and much of the support product that a miniatures games or a miniatures producer would carry. A second stage store would generally be known as a hobby/games store or a games/hobby store, depending on their bent and their specifics. And it wasn't truly double line yet. These were stores that were hedging their bets. So yes, they carry their stable lines like the train sets or the miniatures sets or the models, the scale models. And I have to say, one of the things that's really fascinating is that in this period, scale modeling was at its heyday. In this case, they had discovered cyanoacrylate, the idea of superglue, and so suddenly you could put your models together much more quickly. It was cumbersome, difficult to work with, and you got to be pretty sophisticated when you could actually paint, to glue your models together, especially when it came to things like clear canopies for aircraft. World War II and after, aircraft had significant parts of smooth curved glass that would have to be emulated in the model, and so they would use clear plastic, but the very glue that worked well to connect plastic to plastic also tended to cause the plastic itself to become malleable, and therefore if you pushed a piece into place with the tip of your finger, you would leave your fingerprint on the glass. So a scale modeler would become one of two things. Either they'd be able to build the model functionally and use it as it was, or they would be very meticulous, very stylized, and very detail-oriented. And these modelers were, I guess you'd say that the equivalent to that would be the high-end Warhammer 40K player of today who spends an inordinate amount of time and money making sure their models look just so. And these models were not toys. They were not meant to be played with. So as we move into the second stage, though, many games players were now starting to branch out. So, for example, in my case, when I would go to the game store, perhaps I wouldn't normally think of buying scale models, but if there was a particular model kit of a sailing vessel, and it happened to come on a pretty solid base, I might go ahead and purchase it from a play standpoint, simply to have a ship for modeling the role-play games situations we were in. And so I would misuse, if you will, I would not be following the production demands of the actual scale modeler. There were a lot of those layers amidships and things like that that I would simply avoid, even though they were purist. I would make the model practical. So I wouldn't add any rigging. I would only add the main masts. I wouldn't do cross members and such. But that way I would have the model that I could represent the movement on. These second stage stores also were the first ones to start with any kind of advertising from the manufacturer. And this had everything to do with the fact that there was a distribution change going on. I was too young to be aware of what was going on, but the distribution of games products was slowly being shifted away from direct mail and manufacturer involvement in the process, but instead these distributors are now streamlining the process. They were figuring out drop ship days and determining how they would use the U.S. mail to get the product from point A to point B. Games discount day would then become associated with the day of the week that product would reach the store based on manufacturers. So that was actually generally Thursdays, because if they shipped on Monday, generally they'd be able to get to their retailer distribution point by Thursdays. And that went on for quite some time. And in those second stage days, the game stores were becoming more stable. A manufacturer could depend on a specific store to carry their product if they launched a new one. And so therefore they were building their understanding of the marketplace. And that developed into what I call a true second line or partial line store. I say second line, partial line because this was the beginning of what historically would have been considered to be the satanic panic era. And there were games properties that were coming out that were actually being built to foment this distortion. Pardon me. They were actually being built to foment or push the button, so to speak, on certain product lines, and therefore the consumer became concerned with what could or couldn't be sold within the space and time of the game store. And so the game store would therefore choose to not carry certain product lines. So, for example, maybe they are a Euro game publisher, so they'll bring in all the European game products from a certain manufacturer, certain distributor. Perhaps they were affiliated with the early play-by-mail, so therefore they'd have support product there in terms of mapping materials and grease pencils. There wasn't really so much lamination, but there were plastic sheeting elements that you could purchase to provide cover for your game's materials. But these partial line stores were very I want to say sophisticated, but that's not really the right term. They were very concerned with not besmirching their image, and so if they happened upon a product that would cross the line between product lines, they would kind of jump at it, because that would be a way to take advantage of the fervor for the game line that was in question, but at the same time it wouldn't cross that line. So games like Talisman and the original Dungeon, these games that came out were emulations of what happened in a role-play game, but they were not actually role-play game products. And these second line stores really capitalized on this and built in the stability of a board game's supporter without crossing the line into supporting those scary role-play games. Furthermore, these partial line, second line stores might only focus on one type of hobby. For example, if they were already a miniature store, it was not a far leap for them to move into the miniatures wargaming, because you already had the diorama, you already had the mountains, you already had the valleys, you had the trees and all of that to make the game feel visually stimulating in that third dimension by actually having models. But it wasn't a far cry for them to do so. So it wasn't like a real stretch on their side to include it. Ironically, those stores that followed the hobby line actually more aligned with the role players perhaps than the other types of second line stores, because a game player would like to make props for his RPG, and where better than do that than to buy the hobby materials. And so it was pretty much a match made in heaven to be a partial line store, carry the pieces that would match up with your property lines that you were already carrying, so you weren't running any risk and you were giving yourself new streams of revenue and diversifying your portfolio. These second line stores did lack in certain properties, in certain product. And so as a young game master, I did a lot of retail farming by trying to find stores that carried the lines that would support me. And the irony is that that early environment was perfect for a world creator like myself, because you didn't have the full line of product from a manufacturer like TSR, partially because TSR was localized to the northern Midwest states, but also because the distributors wouldn't carry their full line simply because there was no dependability of the potential sales of those items. So distributors also were being careful. Then along came the biggest change, and this period of the second line partial line store really was the critical line that got shifted over when distribution changed. For those of you that are unaware, the comic books industry parallels the role-play games industry quite directly. The comic books had the comic book publishers had exactly the same issues that a role-play game publisher had to deal with. It had to do with production quality. It had to do with paper type. It had to do with the production methodology, whether it was saddle stitch or perfect bind, or all these little elements really played into the development of both genres. And what affected the comics books industry, therefore, necessarily affected RPG production. And even though the stores that were comic book stores may not be a second line, they may not carry RPGs as a second line, nonetheless, the very things that they faced affected those stores that were carrying RPGs but were not carrying comics. So these issues included distribution, and one of the largest distributors of the time was known as Diamond Comics. And Diamond Comics realized that one of the biggest reasons why there was open competition for them is that everybody was following the same methodology for distribution. In other words, everybody was making their product to be shipped out on a Monday, therefore delivered on a Thursday, and that delay in product for 4 days meant everybody was on an even playing field. So Diamond determined that there was this up-and-coming company called UPS and decided that they would commit to using 3-day shipping, the idea of getting product to their resources early. And in relatively short order, within, I would say, 6 months to a year, they had taken command of the distribution of almost all comic book publishers, simply by saying, we guarantee you our product will get to you 1 day earlier than your competitor. And what retailer isn't going to take up that edge? And at first, it was a boon for the retailers, because now the product gets to their site earlier. They get a chance to package it, get it ready for their retail on Thursday. But then they realized, well, we've got clients that are willing to pay a little extra, so why don't we go ahead and pay for that shipping for our entire shipment, and then we'll aggregate the cost across all of our product lines, and thereby have all of our comic books in-house a day early, and therefore we can open these shelves half a day early or a day early. And so the marketplace radically changed at that point, providing a level of stability to distribution, guaranteeing the product would be literally in the hands of the consumer earlier, and therefore creating a necessity marketplace. And this led to the primary line retailers. Now, most of these primary line retailers also were discriminatory, and not in any kind of before your brain kicks over and says discriminate. What I'm meaning is that they carried only the product lines and the types of products they wanted to carry, and therefore they might have a rider where they would carry an ancillary product. So, for example, a primary line games retailer might carry every style of games that are out there, and also carry wood pieces and wooden product along the lines of really high-class chessboards, high-class backgammon boards, inlaid wood artwork, and so on. But these were supporting lines They were picking up the main line of games, and suddenly they were now discriminating in terms of inside their store the space for those games that were family oriented from those games that were specialty oriented from those products that were hobby oriented. And they might carry, for example, some lines of models. There were games at the time like Mustangs and Messerschmitts that was actually a game designed for playing with scale models, and so those certainly had a support within those game stores that carried models and tabletop games materials. But the gist here is that the stores now were stable enough to be defined as game stores. And we're still talking considerably long ago, in the 50, now we're talking about well within the 50 years of my existence. But the idea here is that suddenly you were able to find a store to buy the Dungeons and Dragons branded material that would support your hobby. And so even though I'd been a creative source and imaginative developer on my own at a really early age, 11, 12, 13, by the time these primary store lines showed up, they were now a resource that you could draw upon to support your hobby, and gave rise to what are now famous intellectual property lines that are out there. And for example, the Tolkienian realms of Middle-earth became open because there were distributors and manufacturers who had gotten onto the licensing regulation that was actually being used for comic books to allow graphics novels and such to be developed. These were the same licensing arrangements that were being fomented for the creation of games materials. There was a huge hubbub in that time frame, for example, with the emergence of the Asian marketplace and the arrival of the idea of the anime manga stories, which were perfect for role play, perfect for miniatures games and such. And these then led to miscommunication and the development of the conflict, for example, that was between Palladium and the producers of the manga that they got involved with at the time. And these challenges were just only doing more to open the marketplace and provide new game lines. So, for example, again, a primary store might carry mostly Western properties and then an entire section of anime manga they may not have ever carried before. And this was directly associated with the distributors because the distributors were expanding the product lines they were carrying as well. And what had been Diamond Comics now became Alliance Books, and the Alliance Book Trade Alliance as a distributor for games properties was instrumental in bringing that change, that speed of delivery, that efficiency of support into the games marketplace, and giving the primary line store really the impetus to continue and to promote themselves. Now, generally, these stores were not associated with the play of games yet. They were simply a retail establishment for the purchase of those products. And so while gamers might hang out there, might find each other in the parking lot, so to speak, these were not necessarily places yet where you could actually set up and play a game. As a matter of fact, many of the tropes that we see, for example, in the Knights of the Dinner Table comic books, all stem from these mainline retailers who also happen to be players of games, and therefore they would set up games in their back rooms and in their warehousing areas and such. So there was, dark, dingy, the whole idea of the single light hanging down, and how crude the play experience was, sitting on boxes of cards or whatever. This was the mechanic that was developing because of the primary lines being able to focus on what the retailer chose to sell and what they chose to carry. Now, when we finally get to full line distribution, Alliance finally makes the corner and is carrying all of the different comic books as well as miniatures and stuff. The Alliance Diamond connection becomes solidified, and now you have full line distribution. The other smaller distributors are being fundamentally forced out of existence because they cannot compete on delivery date, because they cannot financially support drop shipping with the efficiency that Alliance could. They just simply couldn't play in that ballpark. And so therefore those smaller distributors had to adapt or fail, and many of them merged together. So Chessex, which had been Chessex and Chessex West, now combined distribution. They used the Western site as a drop ship location so that they could fulfill faster. But the idea of the small distributor like Blackhawk, or I can't even remember all their names, but these smaller distributors stayed in business mainly because they had made arrangements with full line retailers that were longer lived, and so therefore they were able to stay afloat simply by supporting those particular retailers. And the product diversity across those lines was marked. You would have retailers arguably enter competitive zones simply because they were bringing in product lines that were not being carried by the other, because the manufacturer would fundamentally have to choose whether he was going to commit to full distribution by Alliance and therefore they only distributed to Alliance stores, or they played the field and sold a few copies into each of the distributors, or they chose to put their foot down and say, I'm not going to go with those mass guys. That's a hobby. That's a fluke. It's going to go away. So we're going to stay with the small distributors. But it was manufacturer suicide fundamentally if they chose poorly in that decision. So the full line distributors were just wiping out the smaller distributors, which meant that there were a lot of high quality games that might be produced, but that never got full distribution because they only worked with a small distributor. And this era therefore led to the value of the big property licenses. So the fact that you would have a license that would approve you for use with Dungeons and Dragons became really important, and the opportunistic way in which TSR and even into the Wizards of the Coast era chose to open that up through the D20 licensing, the OGL, really changed the landscape, because now manufacturers of small line products could align themselves with the big line products and therefore be able to get picked up by those major distributors. Even if they only sold a small volume, it was nonetheless getting into that mass distribution and getting the possibility of being in all markets across the country. And this change in full line distribution meant that retailers now could carry full line games products and satisfy the majority of the games playing populace. Now, the irony is that this also tended to drive out the very hobby marketplaces that had been important. The need for the models to be more resilient, to be used as playing pieces, meant that the scale modelers lost shelf space because the highly detailed models simply weren't being carried anymore. And if they did carry a line from, say, Revel, they would carry all of their Revels. I can't remember what there's a term for it, but there was no glue required. Oh, Snap-Tite, the Snap-Tite brand from maybe it was Monogram. The models could be pushed together, and they were designed in such a way that they would click together and it would stay solid without any glue. Well, this opened up. They were not really any longer the idea of models for models' sake, but they were models for play use, and there was a lot of this innovation going on, utilizing models for different reasons. There were the motion pictures opened this up through Mad Max, the idea of a post-apocalyptic world where gasoline was most important, highly attractive. The idea of putting guns on your models had gone back even earlier than that, because there are a lot of kids from my era which were World War II aficionados in their own right, but they were also big on adaptation of modern. So the idea of gluing the guns from your 172nd scale ME-262 onto your 1967 Ford Fairlane Hot Wheels car or Matchbox car. That was, woo, that's cool. We're doing that. And this led, therefore, to a slide from the more sophisticated to the more simplified. And I think in some ways that's kind of an archetype of the way the marketplace has continued to slide into the electronics market, because the purchase of and the production of a scale model of an aircraft for use in play was easier done with the snap tight model. And in like fashion, nowadays it's far easier to sell a PDF of a property than to actually have to go through the production of a book and then ship the book. And so there's been this constant slide to simplification, ironically, because as they slide towards lack of sophistication in that fashion, they do create almost a I can see the name in my head, Dublin-Kruger effect kind of situation where they don't have as much to know, and therefore they think they know it better than others. And so the sophistication of the gameplay becomes more an element of what you know about games than the actual concepts of game theory. And this is therefore seen or predicated in the games marketplace, because a full-line game store is going to carry board games, he's going to carry role-play games, he's going to carry miniatures games, he's going to carry what came next, which ironically split the marketplace again, and that's trading card games. And in the trading card games development, you now have stores starting to bifurcate their lists. They become the mass marketers, move the most popular of those board games over to accessibility through Walmart and other large why does the brain do that to me? That's not word discount. Department stores. The idea of each store having multiple departments. The big box stores, the mass retailers now are getting access to the more popular of these board games. And that really was actually a factor of the manufacturer wanting to break out of the stigma of being involved with these full-line stores, because a full-line retailer would have the niche marketplaces, the trading card games, the regular board games, the miniatures games, all of which were themselves isolating within the framework so that they would hold their particular skills as sacrosanct. And therefore, a person who was a miniatures player might look down his nose at a classic grognard wargamer, whereas a wargamer might sneer at role play, whereas the role players might disparage the card games. This breakdown, therefore, of all of these specialty marketplaces opened a way for the big boxes to get involved, and the distributors who sold product into the mass had a whole new set of problems they had to deal with. The small manufacturers didn't require or even understand the idea of a product return policy. The big boxes mandated it. The idea that the retailer could choose at some point to stop carrying and therefore force the manufacturer to buy back any excess inventory was problematic and a whole new element in the property. And this led to the development of smaller manufacturer support companies called fulfillment houses, and that led to persons that were literally buying product at wholesale with the idea of selling it into distribution for their small piece of the action, but they were sophisticated enough to know their place in the marketplace. And all of these things, every single one of these steps has been an advancement in one way and a step backwards in another. As we went from a second stage store, we were trusting that the properties were going to be more stable. Therefore, we went to become a partial line store. But if the partial line wasn't solid enough price-wise, then we would have to increase the price on the product simply to make ends meet. And that raising of a price caused a shift of the marketplace, so that the primary line store had a better chance because they were carrying the product at a static price, but then they had to carry writers and so on and so on and so on. So in the modern era, we now have something that's developing that I really appreciate, and that is the idea of a full service community. Yes, the game stores are game stores, but these game stores today that carry full lines also are supporting all the different styles of play. So a full service community is going to have card playing tournaments. They're going to have board games extravaganzas. They're going to have role play on a regularized basis. They're going to have campaigns, stories. They're going to have individual one-shots. They're going to be covering the product for those who are theater of the mind like myself, but they're also going to carry the highly detailed scale models and miniatures and such for that genre as well. And the idea here is that the full service community that we survive with today is in a far better place when it comes to providing support for the games community. If you haven't yet, I would highly recommend visiting your local game store and find out which kind it is. Where does it fit in this evolution? Granted, there are game stores today that are still specialty hobby stores that carry a few games products. There are specialty hobby stores that focus on one or more games lines, but also carry additional property types. There are second line stores that are comics book stores and game stores. So find out what kind of store you have and put it here in the comments. We'd love to hear from you about that. Additionally, which do you find to be more useful to you? Are you a person that looks for property advancement? In other words, are you looking for the next installment of, say, the Weatherlight Saga in Magic the Gathering? Or are you going to be more concerned with, say, the storyline of roleplay games and the world of Faerun? Perhaps you are, like I am, much more of a broad spectrum, how can I use this to fit my world kind of gamer, where I'm looking for what will produce the right resources for the games that I am running. Let us know about how that works out. Also, ask your retailers: are they in full line distribution, or do they buy from specialties still? I'd be fascinated to know who they are finding distributing. I know that many of the companies that I used to know personally, because I was involved as the marketing director for Gamma, I know that many of those distributors simply don't exist anymore, and the ones that do have been streamlined to the point that they are truly full line distribution. But very few of them actually cross that line into distribution to big box. So if you know of a company that's done that, tell me about that as well. I'd love to have this conversation with you, either directly or through the comment section on YouTube. Finally, if you haven't yet found your local game store, do a quick search and find where your full service communities are nearest you. I'd be fascinated to help build a demographic feel for where those stores are and promote them to expand the number of people playing all styles of games, because it doesn't matter to me whether you are a card game player or a miniatures player. You are all players, and you are all therefore in the right place to become a member of our community. So as I said before, check out patreon.com/Nykos for more information. We are here Monday through Friday, 10 a.m. and 11 p.m. We are generally about a half an hour to an hour long show in both of those time frames. Love to have you be part of our community. Once you become a member of our Patreon community, you actually get automatic access to our Discord channel. And through that, then you can become a player in our games on Saturdays and Sundays. We also have our full service games support through Board Games Paradise in Redlands, California. And we run games there Monday nights and Tuesday nights, 6 p.m. until 10 p.m. We'd love to have you be part of that as well. So if you're in Southern California, check that out. Otherwise, I will see you on our next broadcast later on tonight. Have a great day, and I'll talk to you soon.